Okay, well let's go on to Vanessa. Vanessa, let's take a look at your aperture images. So immediately we can see that one is much darker than the other. So let's address that first. You were in the manual mode, and that is great. I'm glad you're using it, but you have to you have to remember to look at the light meter, because when you change any setting, the camera won't compensate for that for you. So the light meter will tell you whether or not you're exposing correctly, but it won't correct it for you in the manual mode. So what happened here was when you changed the aperture, which is great, you did not also change the shutter speed. So you changed the aperture here from f5.6, which is pretty wide open, down to f22, which is pretty shut down, but kept the shutter speed the same. And so f22, of course, lets in a lot less light than f5.6. And so what you would want to have done was to use a slower shutter speed that lets in more light to compensate for the fact that you're letting less light in here at f22. That said, in terms of the depth of field, let's take a look. And I think it's obvious immediately that in the image where you used f5.6, the depth of field is much shallower. I think it's a duck, and oh, look at the turtles, are in beautiful focus, but the foreground and the background are in soft focus, so that's great. And here at f22, we can see that the depth of field is much greater, even though it's pretty dark. So I'm just going to quickly increase the exposure so we can see it. We can see that it's a little too bright, but that's okay. We can see that now the foreground and the background are in great focus at f22, so good job. We'll look at distance, and here you are further away, and this is about 20 feet, and the aperture is at f5.6, and we can see that the depth of field actually is pretty shallow, even though you're far away, but also your focus is not quite spot on, and that's true for both of these. So it's a little difficult to tell. What I would say is shoot where you have one thing closer to the frame, to the camera, and then you have space going back in the frame, and come in a little closer to the subject, and then we can really see a change in the depth of field. And I'm not sure why this is out of focus, why they are both kind of fuzzy, because your last images, the last set, they were in great focus, fine focus. Okay, focal length of the lens, beautiful capturing of this great blue heron. How wonderful. So you have the aperture at f11, and the focal length of the lens is at 300, which is pretty long. And if we come in a little closer, we can see that the background is definitely out of focus. You, of course, weren't, I think, that close to the bird, so that's fine. But we can see that the depth of field is pretty shallow there. And further away, with the focal length of the lens, that is, at, it says here, 55 millimeters. Now it's become a much more broad vista, right? With the what is that here for? Sorry, with the great blue heron visible, but only as just a general part of the landscape. But looking at the background here, I'll come in even closer. we can see that it is definitely much sharper back here. So the shorter focal length, it's definitely giving us greater depth of field. Okay, great job. Just remember to keep, to pay attention to your light meter if you're going to be shooting in the manual mode. You can also shoot in the aperture priority mode, and in that case, the camera will compensate for those changes for you. So you choose the aperture, and the camera will automatically set the appropriate shutter speed. Okay, good job. Okay, Christine Luong, let's take a look at your images. So for aperture, these are what we have. Interesting panoramic view here, and interesting choice of what you've decided to isolate. So let's come in a little closer and check out the depth of field. So here at f5.6, the foreground is certainly in focus, at least the mirror, and the background is definitely in soft focus. And at f36, a very small aperture, we can see that everything is in focus from the foreground to the background. So good job there. I see you're shooting in manual. That's great. The images, and I noticed that I think this is true of all of the images, they seem a little foggy. They are a little bit hazy, and I'm wondering if you adjusted them after the fact. So get back to me on that. But at any rate, okay, good job on aperture. Let's look at distance. The highlights are really, really bright, but and I think it looks as if you brought them down. I don't know if that is so in photos. So you're shooting in the manual mode, and so I was wondering if the exposure had been off a little bit and you corrected. But anyway, let's look at the depth of field. So in this image, you're 6 feet away, and I assume the car is the point of focus. And in the next image, 1 foot away, keeping the aperture at f5.6, and we can see that the background is definitely out of focus, is in soft focus when you're closer to the point of focus, the car. So that certainly works well for depth of field. In terms of composition, you might, if the car is what is of interest to you, you might emphasize that more, perhaps coming around to the front and having it fill the frame in a more organized fashion. But in terms of depth of field, they work. And focal length of lens. So this image at 18 millimeters, so relatively wide angle lens at f22. So that will certainly give you greater depth of field. Let's see this next one, telephoto at 400, so considerably longer. It's difficult to see a change in the depth of field, and here's why. Because the sky is at infinity, and there are no clouds in the sky, so we really can't tell if it's in focus or not. So you might try having something between the point of focus and the sky, so that we can tell that the depth of field has changed. Okay, all right, good job, Christine. Thank you. Okay, let's see. Longhae, I hope I'm saying your name correctly. So these are your aperture images, and it looks as if you did a really nice job on these. Difficult lighting situation where the subject is backlit, which would tend to throw the subject into shadow, but you did a very nice job with these. So this image with the aperture at f2, so wide open, a nice shallow depth of field, and f22, much smaller, with very great depth of field. And they are, this essentially the same in terms of composition, but the shallow depth of field image definitely isolates the subject from the background much more, and directs our eyes, the viewer's eyes, to the subject. In the image with the great depth of field, the subject is obviously still in the center of the frame, but we have much more of a sense of what is around her as well. And either works fine. Many portrait photographers do tend to use shallow or shallower depth of field in order to isolate the subject from the background, to emphasize the subject. But great job on both of these. Distance from subject, lovely images. For some reason, the metadata, the information about these images did not come through, and it looks as if maybe you used a different camera. So I'm not sure why it didn't come through, but you noted that the lens was at 70 millimeters and the aperture at f2.8. So when you're further away, obviously the depth of field is greater. And the depth of field has obviously changed here in the closer image, with the background falling out of focus very nicely. And both images work well. They are obviously two different images. And the image on the left from further away really gives us a sense of where this person is, the context. The image on the right, where you've come in closer, is more of a study of the individual. In fact, more of her as a form, I guess, with the tree behind her, because she's not looking at us, her eyes are closed, so we don't make contact with her. Okay, good job. And focal length of lens. You change from 35 millimeters to 58, which isn't really a huge change. So I would recommend using the extremes of your lens if you have a zoom lens, or if you have two different lenses. 58 is not a focal length that you find generally as a standalone lens. So yeah, so I'd like to see a little more difference in terms of the focal length of the lens, because this, you can see if we look at these images, one is a little further away, further back than the other, but not that much. And at f2, the depth of field will be shallow in both images. And we can see that. So you might try shooting at f8, and then shooting with a longer lens and shorter. So I don't know what lens you have on your Nikon. It says for this one you have a 35 millimeter lens, but does not say if that is a fixed focal length lens or part of a zoom lens. Anyway, okay, but good job, and thank you very much. Okay, Praveen. So here are your aperture images, and it looks as if maybe you used, is this right, the iPhone, and so you didn't actually change the aperture. The phone shot it, and then I guess you changed the setting afterwards. Is that correct? But it certainly shows the change in depth of field nicely. it's recorded as 1/20th of a second at f2.4 for each image. So maybe get back to me on that. But there's certainly a huge change in the depth of field. So good job on the aperture. With the distance from subject, I'm unclear on this one because nothing is really recorded for the far image. Close up it says f11 at 6 millimeters, but there is no information for the one that's further away. So yeah, if you get back to me on that one, that would be great. And in terms of composition, I'm kind of wondering what it is you saw here of interest. So get back to me on that too. I think that the close-up works better because you don't have all that background information. Okay, and let's look at your focal length images. Difficult to see a change in the depth of field here. The background is not very far away from the point of focus. So I think it would work better if you were further back from the background and maybe had more elements, physical elements going back in the frame so we could see a change in the depth of field. Yeah, I'm kind of wondering what you saw here also. So maybe I see somebody holding the controls. I don't know if that was you or someone else. If it was someone else, pull them in and make them sit too. Okay. All right. So take a look at those things, and you might want to reshoot those. But you're welcome to talk to me about them. Okay, thank you. Okay, Katie Min. Beautiful job on these, Katie. So aperture here, coming in close to this, is it an onion blossom? It's lovely. So this one at f1.8, so very large aperture, and very, very shallow depth of field. Beautifully isolated. And is that some sort of insect there, maybe? And here at f22, a much, much smaller aperture, of course, and we can now see the background, where in the earlier one, we had no idea what was in the background. Now we do. In terms of isolating the subject, the shallow depth of field, works better in directing the viewer's eyes to that point. But the depth of field here is great, much greater, and it gives us a sense of place, of context, and great job on both of these. Okay, let's look at your distance images. Okay, so here closer, a 40th of a second at f10, and the depth of field is definitely shallow, not incredibly shallow, but shallow. The foliage in the background is definitely in soft focus. And further back, so same settings, good, at f10 anyway, and the background is most definitely in sharper focus. So even when we come in close at 100% magnification, the background is definitely sharper when you're further away. Okay, great job on those. And focal length, so we look at both here. So the point of focus is that blue thing, I guess. All right. So in this image, you're at a 1/160th of a second at f3.5 and an 18 millimeter lens. And the depth of field is definitely pretty great, even at f3.5, which normally would give pretty shallow depth of field. But when you're further back and using such a wide-angle lens, that kind of overrides the large aperture. Okay, and here at 200 millimeters, much longer lens, and the aperture changed, and that is because you changed, of course, the focal length of the lens, and so the maximum aperture does change as you change the focal length of the lens in a zoom lens. But yes, much shallower depth of field, isolating the subject, of course, by using the long lens, which has the same effect as physically walking in closer. But great job on all of these. Excellent. Thank you, Katie. Okay, Michelle Nguyen. Michelle, I would like you to have labeled these images and put them in separate folders. That said, let's take a look at them. So I think probably you should reread the assignment, but I think that these first two images, well, I'm not quite sure. So the focal length has stayed the same. Is that right? No, it's changed by 5 millimeters. The aperture has stayed the same. And so the depth of field actually has stayed about the same too. This next set, let's see. The focal length has changed from 27 here to 18. The f-stop, the aperture is the same. And I can't tell if you've changed distance or not. And then finally here, 18 millimeters and 32 millimeters. So in each of these sets, you changed the focal length of the lens, but did not change aperture, and if you did change distance, I can't tell. So the assignment is to isolate the three things that change depth of field: the aperture, the focal length of the lens, and the distance from the subject. So in the first set, you should stay in the same place and keep the aperture, and keep the focal length of the lens the same, changing only the aperture, and then of course you have to change the shutter speed to compensate for changing the amount of light. In the second set, you are to change the focal length of the lens, keeping the aperture and the distance from subject the same. And then in the third set, you are to keep the aperture the same and the focal length of the lens the same, and actually change your physical distance from the subject or point of focus. So if you want to redo those, I'm happy to accept them. And of course, I record the higher of the two grades. Okay, thank you. David, let's look at your images. You did a great job on these. So in the aperture category, 1/1600th of a second at f5.6 and 1/100th of a second at f25. So yeah, huge difference in the depth of field. Both beautiful images. The shallow depth of field, of course, isolates the point of focus, the flower, the rose, from the background. And with the smaller aperture at f25, we see, of course, the rose in focus, but also have a much better sense of the background, of the surrounding information. So distance, what a sweet dog. So here, 1 foot away at f5.6, and get rid of the information there. And we can certainly see that the background is in soft focus relative to the dog. And here at 8 feet away, definitely a difference, and a difference certainly in the dog's expressions. Dog's awake here, but the background is in focus. And so we have a sense of the setting, of the context of the dog. So great job on both of them. And finally, focal length of the lens. Here at 55 millimeters at f7.1, and then 200 millimeters at f5.6. So the aperture changes slightly when you change the focal length of the lens. But great job on both, and this certainly gives us a sense of place, of where we are, and the shallow depth of field isolates these flowers in the flower pot. So very nicely done. Beautiful use of color as well. Okay, great job. Thank you.